Alien medics had treated hundreds of species, but when they opened up this human, their tools weren't the problem. The problem was the body fighting back, silently, from the inside out. The triage ward of the Varellin Forward Mobile Medical Unit was a masterclass in interspecies coordination. Fluorescent panels shifted in hue to match patient biofrequency. Language conversion drones buzzed overhead, and sanitation bots hummed on the move, deftly avoiding medics who sprinted in organized chaos. Nothing surprised Senior Surgeon Delvin anymore. Not the six-limbed Unguth, who'd swallowed their own pain-absorbing gland again. Not the Creel, whose blood crystallized on exposure to oxygen. Not even the young Anthali soldier who'd embedded a live beacon under his own skin to act as a walking tracker. But this was something else. The human had arrived in a med pod coated in what Delvin initially assumed was engine soot. It wasn't. It was dried blood, some of it his own. The emergency beacon attached to his jacket had been manually activated, its edge chipped, likely from blunt force. He'd been airlifted off the southern crater of Hrothdy 9 after an ambush left half his unit buried under collapsed geothermal vents. Half his ribs were bruised or cracked, the left shoulder dislocated, and the lacerations on his abdomen had started to smell faintly of infected tissue. The man was conscious, barely. Delvin hovered over the body, 3 hands holding scanners, one already prepping the surgical tray. "Vitals fluctuating," Nurse Javi reported, glancing at the monitor. "Core body temp 37.1 Celsius, heart rate 109, no signs of organ rupture, but... Sir, these readings don't add up." Delvin's eyes narrowed. He focused the scanner on the abdominal region, zoomed in, then stopped, rewound the scan, then ran it again. He adjusted the gain. No difference. The lungs had shifted 2 inches downward between scans, taken less than 60 seconds apart. The stomach, once nestled neatly under the diaphragm, now floated to the left like a confused sponge. And the intestines, Delvin double-checked, were undulating independently, as if in performance. He looked down. The man's eyes were open. Blood crusted his lower lip and his left eye was swollen nearly shut, but he met Delvin's gaze. "Are your internal systems malfunctioning?" Delvin asked. The man smiled, crookedly. His voice was a strained whisper. "Nah, they just move around. Keeps predators guessing." Delvin froze. His assistants did not. 2 more pairs of gloves worked to clean the wound, disinfect the area, apply local anesthesia. But Delvin stared at the readout. Organs didn't migrate. That was structurally inefficient, logistically absurd. "They move voluntarily?" he asked. "Depends," the human rasped, then winced as disinfectant stung open skin. "Stress response. Sometimes involuntary. Body just tries to play hide and seek when it panics." "Are you mocking me?" "Only a little," the man murmured, eyes slipping closed again. Delvin didn't answer. Instead, he marked the scan with a bright red tag and added a short note in the file. "Anatomically unstable. Threat level undetermined." The surgery had to go on, not because they understood the anatomy, but because the human would die if they didn't. 2 hours later, Delvin sat back, exhausted and thoroughly disturbed. The shoulder had been relocated manually with assistance from a physical manipulator brace, which took 23 minutes alone. 6 abdominal lacerations were cleaned and sutured, with partial reconstruction of the anterior fascia using self-dissolving mesh. The internal hemorrhaging had been minor but made difficult by how the spleen had meandered toward the left kidney like a stubborn pet. The surgical team had to rescan multiple times mid-procedure just to find the pancreas, and the movement never stopped. At one point, the liver shuddered and shifted upward a full 2 inches. Delvin had halted the procedure to ensure it wasn't spasming from trauma. It wasn't. It just moved. When they were done, the human was sedated and resting in the observation chamber, tubes feeding him nutrients, sensors mapping his vitals. Delvin reviewed the logs again. No equipment malfunction, no scanning errors. Maybe their insides don't follow logic, Javi muttered beside him. We've seen weirder. No, Delvin replied. We've seen different. Not contradictory. Back in the recovery room, the man stirred. His name, according to the records, was Miles Carter. Infantry, Earth Detachment, 34 years old, medical history, allergic to bee stings, and a bullet lodged in his left hip from 6 years ago that no one had managed to remove safely. Delvin approached quietly, stood beside the bed. Miles Carter? He said. Are you able to speak? Miles cracked an eye open. Depends. You gonna poke me again? No, Delvin said. Not unless your organs start migrating out of incision boundaries. Can't promise they won't, Miles said, voice drier than before. They get twitchy. Delvin stared at him. Why? Instinct, maybe? Evolution? Maybe they got tired of being sitting ducks? Miles took a breath and winced. You know, trial by predator. Delvin shook his head slowly. Your organs are not autonomous. They are not sentient. Miles blinked at the ceiling. And yet, here we are. Delvin marked another note. Patient prone to delusional humor. Psychological screening recommended. Then again, perhaps it wasn't delusion. Perhaps this was some form of internal defense humans had evolved, an adaptation no other species on record exhibited. No predator would ever count on an organ to stay where it belonged. Still, Delvin couldn't shake the unease. Surgery required stability, predictability. Anatomy had rules. But humans, apparently, had exceptions. 3 days after surgery, Miles Carter was stable but far from healthy. He remained under round-the-clock monitoring in the Biointen Center recovery suite. Delvin personally reviewed every scan, every update, and every time he pulled up the newest imaging of the human's torso, he was met with more bafflement. The organs had not returned to their original post-op positions. In fact, several had migrated again, though not in any way that resembled failure or complication. The heart's left ventricle had rotated 7 degrees clockwise. The stomach had tucked itself behind a segment of intestine like it was hiding from the scan. This wasn't recovery. This was choreography. Javi brought the morning assessment log. He's metabolizing well. Tissue regeneration's on schedule. Sutures are intact. But you're going to want to see this. Delvin turned the display. The chart showed a pattern. Every few hours, small but consistent positional changes in the visceral layout. This is not post-trauma swelling, Delvin muttered. Nope, Javi said, pointing to a cluster of data. It's controlled. Like internal repositioning based on stimulus. Look here. Every time we adjusted the environmental temperature, there was a shift. Thermal response? Maybe, or threat-based. Delvin frowned. Why would intestines respond to perceived threat? Javi shrugged. You ever see a chameleon's skin shift color in dreams? Maybe it's not conscious. Delvin stared back at the imaging. I want him upright, walk-tested. If the organs are responding to stimuli, we need to know their parameters. The recovery protocol was accelerated, against better judgment. But Miles didn't argue. He walked, slowly, stiffly, with the help of an assisted frame. Every movement was logged. At the end of the day, the scans were run again. The liver had shifted laterally. The small intestine had looped more tightly around itself. The bladder had retreated slightly higher into the abdominal cavity. Is this defensive reorganization? Delvin asked aloud, more to himself than the others. No, Miles replied from across the room, pale and damp with sweat. It's evolutionary insurance. Delvin turned. You are conscious of it? Not exactly. Miles eased onto the bed, wincing. But humans, we've had predators a long time. Teeth, claws, bullets, knives, internal organs that squirm away when pain's close. That's the body adapting. Are you telling me your viscera can detect incoming injury? Miles gave a grim half-smile. I'm telling you that 100,000 years of ambushes made some weird survival tricks stick. I once knew a guy who got impaled in the abdomen. Liver shifted just enough that he didn't bleed out. Doctors said it looked like it dodged. That's impossible. That's what they said about earth frogs freezing solid and waking up in spring. Delvin opened his mouth to retort, but Hobby spoke first. Sir, he's not wrong. Human internal systems demonstrate remarkable variance across individuals. No two hearts beat quite the same under stress. Spleens vary by shape. Adrenal responses vary across geography. Delvin waved her off. Variation is not mobility. This is unprecedented. This is anatomy as evasion. He made a decision. Miles Carter, he said, stepping closer, we are submitting your data to the Union Medical Commission. You are an outlier, possibly a biological anomaly. Miles snorted. I get it. You want to turn me into a paper. No, Delvin said. I want to understand if this is an individual fluke or a species-wide concern. Miles leaned back against the pillows, closed his eyes. You think it makes us dangerous? Delvin hesitated. I think it makes you unpredictable. That night, the scans were run continuously, and they revealed something new. In response to ambient sonic frequency changes, barely above white noise, the human spleen contracted and shifted position. The stomach flattened slightly, mimicking a stress position, as if bracing. By morning, the digestive tract had fully compressed around the small intestine, not disordered, just condensed, like it was preparing for sudden movement. This is the first patient I've had to track like a migrating species, Delvin muttered. We need a containment strategy in case anything dislocates internally. We should inform Earth Command, Chavi suggested. No, not yet. I want to know if this is trained behavior, if they teach this. Later that day, Miles was helped into a modified rehab suit. It supported his torso while allowing mobility, reducing strain on healing tissues. He moved slowly but insisted on walking the full corridor loop. As he passed the med bay's observation deck, a group of Virellan interns stared, whispering. One pointed to his chest. That's the one. The organs don't sit still. Miles glanced their way and gave a tired wave. Tell your anatomy professor, I'm an elective course now. One of the interns blinked in confusion. Delvin did not laugh. That night, Delvin updated the patient file again. Subject, Carter, Miles. Status, recovering. Mobility, restored, limited. Anatomy, mobile visceral layout. Notes, patient exhibits subdermal reactivity to perceived threat. Internal repositioning, verified. Intentionality remains unclear. Recommend longitudinal study. Caution. Instinctive unpredictability high. Internal damage potential during standard procedures elevated. He hesitated, then added a new tag. Potential combat utility unknown. Threat profile increasing. 3 more days passed. Miles was recovering steadily. Scars knitted. Energy returned. But the scans kept changing. There was no standard to his internal arrangement. Nothing about his abdominal structure ever returned to its surgical configuration. It was as if his body, satisfied that trauma was past, had decided to improvise entirely. And that terrified Delvin more than if the man had collapsed mid-recovery. On the 9th day post-op, Delvin entered the room with a full consult team. He was going to request cooperation for invasive monitoring over the next 6 weeks. Miles was missing. Alarms blared. Nurses scrambled. Doors locked down. He was found 40 minutes later in the medical garden, sitting beneath a heat lamp with a mug of broth and a healing brace still wrapped around his midsection. Are you aware you left the recovery ward against protocol? Delvin asked, fury in his throat. I got bored, Miles said, not looking up. The walls echoed too much. Heard my liver shift last night, needed sunlight. Delvin stared at him. You are not allowed to self-diagnose. You are not allowed to relocate yourself. You are a patient under post-op observation. You're not my jailer. Delvin stepped forward. You're a man with an unstable gut layout and a cardiovascular system that behaves like it's playing musical chairs. We need to monitor you. Miles looked up finally. "You don't need to monitor me, you need to understand me." Delvin's response was instant. "We don't understand what we can't map." Miles's eyes narrowed. "Then stop trying to draw a map and start learning the terrain." Delvin stared, unsure if he was being challenged or instructed. Either way, he updated the file again that night. Patient conscious response, engaged, challenging. Cognitive state, stable. Recovery time remaining, estimated 3 weeks if progress continues. Long-term assessment required. Behavioral note, does not comply with passive recovery. Disrupts assumptions, possibly intentionally. Final note, observation ongoing. Anatomy uncertain. Strategic risk undetermined. By the 3rd week, Miles Carter could walk without assistance and sleep through the night without pain. His abdominal stitches had dissolved. Range of motion in his left shoulder was nearly normal. But the real progress, at least from Delvin's clinical view, was what happened under the skin. The organ drift had stabilized, not ceased, but settled into what could almost be called a pattern. The kidneys maintained a general lateral sway, returning to baseline after 2 to 3 hours. The liver's micro-adjustments followed thermal cues. The stomach continued to reposition in response to audio frequency, though no longer as dramatically. But it was the intestinal tract that held the team's attention now. Segmental contractions no longer obeyed purely digestive rhythms. Instead, they reacted subtly to emotional spikes. Measurable shifts in cortisol and adrenaline levels corresponded with localized tension and even mild relocation of intestinal loops. The bowels were listening to fear. "His intestines are participating in his mood swings," Javi whispered during a review meeting. Delvin didn't argue. He simply submitted the formal request: transfer Miles to Simulation Ward 3. He needed data from controlled threat environments. Simulation Ward 3 was built for species with complex neurobiological feedback loops. It replicated safe, non-lethal, but cognitively immersive stressors. The entire room was adaptive, from lighting to ambient scent dispersal. Miles was fitted with an ultralight biosuit with neural telemetry nodes and led inside. "This isn't torture, is it?" Miles asked, eyeing the blinking lights on the wall. "No," Delvin said. "This is science." The first trial was mild, sudden lighting shifts and ultrasonic pulses. The second involved visual disorientation. Patterns mimicking depth illusion flickered across every wall. Then came the simulated threat protocols. A drone, shaped like a scaled-down war beast, roared from the far wall. Miles didn't flinch, but his vitals spiked, and the scan showed the spleen press itself tightly against the posterior stomach wall, the large intestine curling into a tighter configuration, shielding the lower left quadrant. They ran it again, louder, closer. The same thing happened. Internal motion, mild bracing, everything just a little more compact, as if the organs had collectively decided to duck. "Do you feel them move?" Delavan asked through the intercom. "No," Miles replied, "but I feel less exposed, like I brace all over, not just muscle." "What do you mean by less exposed?" "I mean, it's like my body's making itself harder to hit." When the session ended, they scanned again. The intestines had fully returned to their prior configuration. Spleen, liver, kidneys, all back to baseline. Internal migration in response to fear. Not lasting, not erratic, reactive. Delvin had dissected over 200 species across 3 galactic sectors. Never once had he encountered an organism whose internal systems behaved like battlefield tacticians. The report drafts grew longer. Medical staff rotated in to assist and record, each drawing their own conclusions. Some saw evolutionary marvel, others a systemic anomaly with dangerous implications. One intern quietly asked if humans should be subject to special containment when injured. Miles noticed. "Starting to feel like an exhibit," he muttered. After his 4th scan that day, You are under medical supervision, Delvin said flatly. Feels like surveillance. It is both. You are recovering under scrutiny because your biology contradicts anatomical doctrine. Miles exhaled through his nose. You ever consider that maybe the doctrine's wrong? Delvin didn't respond. Instead, he reviewed the logs. One entry stood out. During a dream episode recorded at 3:20 while Miles was in REM sleep, a sudden spike in stress indicators was followed by momentary rearrangement of the gastrointestinal tract. It held for 7 minutes before returning to normal. There had been no external threat. The threat was imagined. The organs responded anyway. A week later, Miles passed the full mobility test. The brace was removed. A final scan was scheduled before discharge. Delvin attended in person. Miles, he said as the scan chamber sealed, do you remember any similar patterns in your family, relatives, anyone else with dynamic anatomy? Miles considered. My uncle once said his heart skipped a beat every time he heard police sirens. Thought it was a joke. Do you think it's genetic? No. Miles paused. I think it's human. Delvin stared at the scan. The organs were still. For now, Miles added, almost too quietly. The final review was held in the tertiary observation dome. Delvin presented to union officials via remote link. His summary was clinical. Data supports unemotional. Conclusion: human internal anatomy exhibits limited autonomous mobility under perceived or imagined threat conditions. This behavior is not voluntary, but may be reflexively integrated with psychological states. Impact on long-term health appears neutral. However, the unpredictability of organ location introduces significant complications to surgical intervention, trauma response, and medical planning. Further research recommended. Do you consider the subject weaponizable? A council member asked. Delvin paused. No, but I consider him unpredictable. Another official leaned forward. Unpredictability can be a weapon. Delvin said nothing. Miles was discharged the next day. Before he left, he stopped at Delvin's office. His movements were slow but fluid, posture upright, scars visible but healing. I read my chart, he said. Anatomically unstable. Threat level undetermined. You really think I'm dangerous? Delvin folded his hands. I think you're hard to categorize. Medicine is structure, predictability. You don't fit. Miles nodded slowly. Neither did penicillin. That's why it worked. He extended a hand. Delvin hesitated, then shook it. Try not to get injured again, Delvin said. I'll let my spleen know, Miles replied. Miles Carter didn't leave immediately. The discharge papers were signed, the medical hold lifted, and transport scheduled. But instead of boarding the shuttle, he sat in the Varellin Infirmary's outer courtyard under a translucent canopy, staring up at the silvery blue clouds that passed through Haratha 9's upper atmosphere. A lightweight field jacket covered his torso, but even so, a sharp turn of the torso made him flinch. His shoulder wasn't fully healed, and the abdominal wall still tugged if he moved too fast. Recovery from major surgery, especially abdominal trauma, took time. Even now, nearly 4 weeks out, he couldn't twist fully or run. That would take at least another 6. But the bruises had faded, the internal bleeding had stopped, the deep muscle sutures were holding. He didn't sit long before Delvin arrived. Your shuttle is waiting, Delvin said. You've delayed boarding for 41 minutes. Miles took a slow breath. You ever get the sense people want you gone just because they don't know what else to do with you? Delvin didn't answer right away. He folded his hands behind his back. There is discomfort around uncertainty, and you are, medically speaking, an unresolved variable. I'm not a variable, Miles said. I'm a guy who didn't die. Delvin sat across from him uninvited. You know, most patients don't attend their own anatomy debrief. You're not most surgeons, Miles said. You don't like not knowing. Correct, Delvin said. And yet, I still don't. Miles looked down at his hands. I keep wondering, what if my organs really did move to dodge that shrapnel? What if I survived because my insides didn't trust their default positions? Delvin's gaze didn't waver. Then I would consider you a biological miracle, one that shouldn't exist by any logical model. Miles didn't laugh. You think we evolved wrong? I think you evolved unexpectedly. Delvin handed him a data pad. There's something you should see before you go. Miles opened the file. It was a comparative scan timeline. His own body, minute by minute, from day 1 through discharge. Overlaying lines tracked the shifting organ positions in relation to neural spikes, environmental changes, and emotional indicators. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm. Stress correlated with a condensed abdominal profile. Relaxation induced drift. Dreams triggered minor organ migration followed by near-instant reset. It was as if his body sought the safest configuration for every moment. Not just survival, but optimization. You believe it's systemic? Miles asked. I believe it's purposeful, Delvin said, not controlled, but intentional, a pattern buried deep. You're not unique in being injured, but your body responded as if it had studied attack patterns. Miles stared at the screen for a long time. So what happens now? You file a report, write a paper, or move on? No, Delvin said. We're adding your data to the Union's interspecies trauma protocols. Every medical team treating humans will now be briefed to expect variable visceral placement under stress. This changes emergency medicine for your entire species. Miles blinked. So, I get stabbed in the gut and you rewrite textbooks? Delvin's expression didn't change. Textbooks require revision when they are wrong. Miles stood slowly. You're not afraid of us, are you? Delvin tilted his head. No, but I am wary of what else I don't know about you. Miles nodded. Fair. He walked with a limp still, favoring his left side, but the movement was steady. At the shuttle dock, he paused before boarding. Javi was there, holding a final data pack for his Earth-based medics. She handed it to him, then hesitated. Your abdominal wall still needs reinforcement. No lifting over 20 pounds, no twisting, no sprinting. Give it 6 weeks minimum. And if you feel pulling across the lower sutures, sit down immediately and breathe, Miles finished. I remember. She offered a smile, then turned to leave. But just before she did, she looked back. Does it hurt? She asked. Miles paused. Only when I forget I'm still healing. Then he boarded. 3 weeks later, Delvin received a secure communique from Earth's Joint Recovery Clinic in Nevada Sector 3. The message was short. Subject: Carter Miles. Status update. Patient completed second-stage physical therapy. Abdominal strength at 82% baseline. No recurrence of internal migration episodes since week 5 post-op. Clearance for non-combat activity granted. Recommended. 3 more weeks restricted activity. Attached was a note, hand-typed. Tell Delvin I don't hear my spleen moving anymore. I think it's sleeping or sulking. Either way, thanks. Miles. Delvin archived the message without comment. But later that day, during a surgical consult with a junior team, he brought up a new entry on the hollow board. Today's topic, he began, is what happens when anatomy decides it has a mind of its own. The interns groaned. Delvin smiled very slightly. At the bottom of his personal log, he added one last note. Carter, Miles. Anatomical status, currently stable. Observation complete. Conclusion. Unmapped doesn't mean broken. Sometimes, survival rewrites the rules.